What year is it right now? Might sound like a crazy question to ask, but what if I told you that no matter what year you think you're living in, it's not actually correct? What if nearly 300 years of history never actually happened? What if the year isn't 2024, but closer to 1727? Welcome to one of the most mind-bending conspiracy tapes by Skoob the Phantom Time Hypothesis. I'm your host, Ryan Martin, and today we're diving deep into a theory that claims the Dark Ages were literally dark because they never existed at all. Let me set the stage for what might be the most audacious rewriting of history ever attempted. The Phantom Time conspiracy doesn't just claim that history played out differently than we've been taught. It's saying that roughly 297 years, specifically between 614 and 911 AD, just never happened at all. Period. These years were supposedly fabricated, inserted into our timeline through falsified records and deliberate manipulation. Think about what this means. Charlemagne never existed. The Carolingian Renaissance, a complete fiction. Vikings raiding monasteries, pure fantasy. According to this theory, someone took our calendar and artificially stretched it, adding centuries that never occurred, creating a phantom period filled with phantom people doing phantom deeds. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This isn't some internet conspiracy that emerged from a basement forum. This theory was formally proposed by a German historian named Herbert Illig in 1991, and it comes with what its supporters claim is serious academic backing. They point to archaeological gaps, inconsistencies in historical records, and problems with our calendar system as evidence that we've been living a lie for over 1,000 years. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds absolutely insane. And you might be right. But before we dismiss it entirely, let's examine the evidence and see what led someone to make such an extraordinary claim. Because whether or not you believe it, the Phantom Time hypothesis raises some genuinely fascinating questions about how we reconstruct the past and what we really know about those mysterious centuries we call the Dark Ages. To understand the Phantom Time conspiracy, we need to understand its creator. Herbert Illig was born in 1947 in Germany, and his career has been entirely centered around historical revisionism, the practice of reinterpreting historical events. In 1989, he became editor of a journal called Prehistory, Proto-History, and Present, and by 1995, he'd started his own publishing company, Mantis Verlag, specifically to promote his unconventional historical theories. But here's the thing about Illig. He's not exactly what you'd call a mainstream academic. There's not even a dedicated Wikipedia article about the man, despite the international attention his theory has received. In Germany, he's been branded as a pseudoscientist, and the general public has been warned not to take his claims seriously. He's become something of a cautionary tale about what happens when conspiracy theories pollute academic discourse. Illig began forming his theory when he started noticing what he considered significant gaps and inconsistencies in early medieval history. He pointed to what he saw as a suspicious lack of archaeological evidence from the period between 614 and 911 AD. He questioned the reliability of historical chronicles from this era, suggesting they were either completely fabricated or based on misinterpreted earlier sources. But Illig's skepticism goes far beyond just the Dark Ages. He's proposed equally controversial theories about prehistory and Egyptian chronology, suggesting a pattern of historical revisionism that extends far beyond the medieval period. This broader context of unconventional theories raises important questions about his methodology and conclusions. What's particularly interesting is that most of Illig's evidence and arguments are published in German, making them less accessible to international scrutiny. This has created a situation where his theories have gained some traction in certain circles, while remaining largely isolated from broader academic debate. So, who supposedly carried out this massive historical fraud, and why? According to Illig, the conspiracy involves some of the most powerful figures of their time: Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. But the motive behind this alleged deception is where things get truly bizarre. Illig claims that Otto III manipulated the calendar specifically so that his reign would begin in the year 1000 AD. Think about the significance of this date in medieval Christian thinking: the millennium, a number loaded with religious and symbolic meaning. By dating his reign to begin with the year 1000, Otto would have gained enormous religious authority and legitimacy. He would have been seen as the emperor of the new millennium, chosen by God to rule at this pivotal moment in Christian history. But here's where the theory becomes almost impossibly complex. For this conspiracy to work, it wouldn't just require manipulating European records. The entire known world would have had to participate in this deception. Islamic record keepers would have needed to add hundreds of years to their own historical documents. Chinese astronomers would have had to falsify their meticulous celestial observations. Jewish scholars would have had to rewrite their chronologies. Byzantine historians would have had to create false records of their own empire's history. According to Illig and his supporters, this explains why Christians, Jews, and Byzantines all introduced new calendars around the same time in the 10th century. It was all part of a coordinated effort to support Otto III's grandiose claims to millennium-based authority. The theory suggests that since the Ottonian dynasty had manipulated their way into power over the Holy Roman Empire, they needed to create a glorious backstory, connecting them to legendary figures like Charlemagne. By inventing or embellishing Charlemagne's accomplishments, they could legitimize their own rule and present themselves as heirs to a great imperial tradition. But this raises an obvious question. How could medieval rulers coordinate such a massive international conspiracy? Communication across continents was slow and uncertain. Different cultures had different interests and motivations. The idea that they would all collaborate to falsify nearly 3 centuries of history for the benefit of one European emperor seems to stretch credibility beyond the breaking point. At the heart of the phantom time conspiracy lies one of history's most famous figures, Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great. According to traditional history, Charlemagne ruled the Frankish kingdom from 768 to 814 AD, conquered much of Western Europe, was crowned emperor by the Pope, and sparked a cultural renaissance that helped preserve classical learning through the Dark Ages. He's been called the Father of Europe, and is considered one of the most important figures in medieval history. But Illig argues that Charlemagne never existed at all. He suggests that this legendary emperor was a fictional character created to fill in historical gaps, a composite figure designed to give legitimacy to later rulers who claimed to be his successors. According to this view, all of Charlemagne's supposed accomplishments, his military conquests, his educational reforms, his cultural patronage, were either invented outright or borrowed from other historical figures and attributed to this fictional emperor. This claim is central to the phantom time hypothesis because Charlemagne's reign falls squarely within the supposedly non-existent period between 614 and 911 AD. If these centuries never happened, then Charlemagne couldn't have existed either. His legendary status and the extensive records of his reign would all have to be later fabrications. But here's where things get complicated. Even if we accept that Charlemagne's reputation might have been exaggerated over time, which is probably true of most historical figures, the evidence for his existence is actually quite substantial. We have contemporary chronicles, administrative records, coins bearing his image, and architectural remains from his reign. We have letters written by scholars at his court, including the famous English monk Alcuin. We have records of his diplomatic correspondence with other rulers, including the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. More importantly, Charlemagne's existence is attested not just in European sources but in Islamic and Byzantine records as well. These independent confirmation sources would all have had to be falsified as part of the alleged conspiracy. The complexity of such a deception seems almost impossible to coordinate, especially in an age of limited communication and frequent conflict between different cultures and empires. Now, this is where the phantom time conspiracy runs into what might be its most serious problem. The sky doesn't lie. Astronomical events follow precise, predictable laws that operate continuously without gaps or human interference. The positions of the sun, moon, planets, and comets can be calculated thousands of years into the past or future with remarkable accuracy. And when we compare these calculations with historical records from different cultures around the world, we get a perfect match. Every single time. Let's start with solar eclipses, because they're dramatic, rare, and impossible to fake. Throughout history, civilizations have carefully recorded eclipses because they were seen as omens or divine messages. The Romans documented them. Chinese astronomers recorded them with meticulous detail. Arab scholars noted their occurrence, and Byzantine chroniclers marked them as significant events. Modern astronomy can calculate exactly when and where every eclipse occurred throughout history. Here's the crucial point. These calculations match historical records perfectly. If 297 years had been artificially inserted into our timeline, the reported eclipses would not fall at the correct points in time. The records would appear shifted or would describe eclipses that never actually occurred. But instead, every major eclipse record that historians rely on fits modern astronomical models exactly. The sky provides an unbreakable timeline that no human conspiracy can alter. Then we have Halley's Comet, which returns roughly every 76 years in a completely predictable orbit. This cosmic timekeeper has been observed and recorded by cultures across the globe throughout history. Chinese astronomers documented its appearances with exceptional precision, and their records match perfectly with modern calculations of when the comet should have appeared. The same accuracy holds for observations made during the Roman Empire, in Islamic chronicles, and in medieval European records. If the phantom time hypothesis were true, these comet sightings would be completely out of sync with the comet's actual orbital period. The dates wouldn't match, and we'd see either impossible observations or missing appearances. But instead, all these records from different cultures, written in different languages across centuries, align perfectly with the comet's true orbital cycle. The consistency extends to planetary motions as well. The positions of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn change in complex but entirely predictable patterns. Medieval and ancient astronomers recorded unusual planetary alignments, conjunctions, and retrograde motions. Modern calculations confirm the accuracy of these observations down to specific dates and locations. Any large shift in the historical timeline would cause these planetary reports to fall completely out of place, but instead they fit seamlessly within our current chronological framework. One of Illig's primary arguments centers on what he sees as a suspicious lack of archaeological evidence from the period between 614 and 911 AD. He points to this apparent gap as proof that these centuries never actually occurred. But this argument reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Dark Ages actually were, and why archaeological evidence from this period might be scarcer than from other eras. The term Dark Ages doesn't mean that nothing happened during this time. It means that fewer written records survived, and those that did often lack the detail and sophistication we see in earlier Roman sources or later medieval documents. But there's a very good reason for this apparent darkness, and it has nothing to do with phantom time. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, it took with it the infrastructure that had supported literacy, education, and record-keeping across Europe. The sophisticated administrative systems that had produced detailed chronicles and maintained extensive libraries largely disappeared. Cities shrank, trade networks collapsed, and in many regions, over 95% of the population was illiterate and struggling with basic survival. This wasn't unique to Europe either. Similar periods of reduced documentation and archaeological evidence can be found in other parts of the world during times of political upheaval, economic collapse, or social transformation. The absence of extensive records doesn't mean these periods didn't exist. It means that the societies experiencing them had more pressing concerns than creating detailed historical chronicles for future generations. Furthermore, archaeological evidence from the early medieval period does exist, contrary to Illig's claims. We have settlements, burial sites, tools, weapons, coins, and religious artifacts dating to this period. The evidence might be less abundant than from some other eras, but it's consistent and continuous. Archaeological dating techniques like radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and thermoluminescence provide independent confirmation of the chronological framework, and these scientific methods don't depend on historical documents that could theoretically be falsified. The idea that an entire civilization could coordinate the creation of false archaeological evidence across multiple continents, using techniques and materials that would fool modern scientific analysis, stretches credibility beyond any reasonable limit. A significant part of Illig's argument focuses on calendar reform, particularly Pope Gregory XIII's introduction of the Gregorian calendar in 1582. Illig points out that when Gregory reformed the calendar, he moved the date forward by 10 days to correct for accumulated errors in the Julian calendar. But Illig calculated that the Julian calendar should have accumulated 13 days of error since its introduction by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, not just 10. He argued that this 3-day discrepancy was evidence that someone had artificially lengthened the historical timeline. On the surface, this might seem like compelling evidence for calendar manipulation. After all, if the math doesn't add up, maybe something really was wrong with our chronology. But when historians and astronomers examined this claim more carefully, they discovered that Illig had incomplete information about how the calendar reform was actually calculated. It turns out that Pope Gregory wasn't trying to sync the calendar with Julius Caesar's original system from 45 BC. Instead, he was correcting the date to bring Easter back in line with the spring equinox, but he was using the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD as his reference point, not the beginning of the Julian calendar. The Council of Nicaea had already accounted for about 3 days of calendar drift that had occurred between 45 BC and 325 AD. So the 10-day adjustment that Gregory made, plus the 3 days already corrected at Nicaea, equals exactly the 13 days of total drift that Illig had calculated. This explanation completely resolves the calendar discrepancy that formed a cornerstone of Illig's argument. There was no missing time, no artificial manipulation, just a more complex calculation than Illig had initially understood. The Pope's mathematical adjustment was precise and appropriate for what he was trying to achieve. This calendar issue illustrates a broader problem with the phantom time hypothesis. It often takes incomplete or misunderstood evidence and leaps to extraordinary conclusions without considering simpler explanations. Good historical analysis requires examining all available evidence and considering the most straightforward interpretation before entertaining more exotic possibilities. The phantom time hypothesis doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader family of historical revisionist theories that question the reliability of traditional chronology. Perhaps the most famous of these is Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology, which makes even more radical claims than Illig's theory. Fomenko, a Russian mathematician, argues that most events before the 11th century never occurred when traditional history says they did. Instead, he claims that many ancient civilizations, Rome, Greece, Egypt, and even biblical kingdoms, are actually literary shadows of medieval states. According to Fomenko's theory, supposed ancient events are simply duplicates of medieval ones that have been artificially pushed backward in time through copying errors, translation mistakes, and deliberate historical reconstruction during the Renaissance. While Fomenko's new chronology is even more extreme than the phantom time hypothesis, both theories share several important characteristics. They both challenge the traditional historical timeline. They both point to gaps or inconsistencies in historical records as evidence of manipulation. And they both suggest that large portions of accepted history are fabrications created by later scholars and political authorities. There's also a related concept called time compression theory, which offers a somewhat more moderate challenge to traditional chronology. Instead of claiming that entire civilizations were invented, time compression theorists argue that certain dark or poorly documented historical periods appear longer than they actually were because the timeline has been artificially stretched. Rather than inventing events, they suggest that gaps in historical records have been filled with extended periods that make history appear longer and more continuous than it really was. These various revisionist theories intersect in their critique of traditional chronology's dependence on later compilers and their vulnerability to political agendas. They all highlight the genuine difficulty of reconstructing ancient and early medieval history when surviving documents are sparse, inconsistent, or filtered through religious and imperial institutions with their own motivations. Whether you find these ideas compelling or ridiculous, they do serve an important function. They remind us that history is not simply discovered, but assembled, interpreted, and sometimes shaped by the assumptions and biases of those who record and preserve it. So, where does this leave us? After examining the evidence, the arguments, and the counter-arguments, what can we conclude about the phantom time conspiracy? The vast majority of historians, archaeologists, and astronomers consider this theory to be thoroughly debunked. The astronomical evidence alone provides multiple independent confirmations of the traditional chronological framework. Solar eclipses, comet appearances, and planetary movements all align perfectly with historical records from multiple cultures across continents. This celestial evidence cannot be forged, manipulated, or coordinated by human conspirators. The archaeological record, while less abundant during the early medieval period, is consistent and continuous. Scientific dating methods provide independent verification that doesn't rely on potentially biased historical documents. The supposed gaps in evidence that Illig identified can be explained much more simply by the social and economic disruption that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. The calendar discrepancy that formed a key part of Illig's argument has been resolved through a better understanding of how Pope Gregory's reform was actually calculated. There's no missing time to account for, no mathematical error that requires extraordinary explanation. Perhaps most importantly, the scale of coordination that would have been required to pull off such a massive historical hoax seems impossible given the communication limitations and political fragmentation of the medieval world. The idea that rulers across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia would all collaborate to falsify 3 centuries of history for the benefit of one Holy Roman Emperor stretches credibility beyond any reasonable limit. But does this mean we should completely dismiss the phantom time hypothesis? Not necessarily. While the specific claims about non-existent centuries are almost certainly false, the theory does raise legitimate questions about historical reliability, the potential for bias in historical records, and the challenges of reconstructing the distant past from fragmentary evidence. The phantom time conspiracy reminds us why skepticism matters, and why it can sometimes go too far. Questioning history is healthy. It pushes us to examine evidence, challenge authority, and understand how power can shape the stories we inherit. But when skepticism turns into certainty without proof, it stops being inquiry and starts becoming belief. Erasing nearly 300 years of history would require flawless deception across continents, cultures, and centuries, and the evidence simply doesn't support that. From astronomy to archaeology, the timeline holds. The sky doesn't lie, and neither do the methods we use to read the past. Charlemagne existed, the centuries unfolded, and yes, we're living in the present, not a manufactured illusion. But here's the unsettling part. If time itself can be questioned, what other truths might feel solid until they're not? That's where the deeper story begins. To explore more hidden theories, unanswered questions, and the evidence most people never talk about, download the Skoob app now and unlock the full story. Dive deeper, listen closer, and decide for yourself what history got right and what it might still be hiding.